Hi again, Jon Nielson with Wing Chun Hall, with more about Wing Chun, your best self-defense option, and today, more about the Wing Chun origin story. So far in this series, I've covered the destruction of Shaolin, Leung the Crane, and the Yim's unwanted marriage. I've shown how while some people use different parts of the story to trace Wing Chun's roots to esoteric sources, this is just a story, and a more plausible source is popular fiction. This trend continues with the next two parts of the story. In Yip Man's story, after Wing Chun defeats the crime boss, she's free to marry her betrothed, Lombok Cho, who learns her fighting system and passes it on to Leung then Leung Yitai and Wang Wabo, and Leung Jan in turn. It should not escape our notice that in the next 4 generations of mythical Wing Chun patriarchs, someone is surnamed Leung. While Leung is a fairly common family name, it is unlikely that even in fiction, 4 generations of men involved in the same activity would have the same surname and not be related. It seems clear then that whoever conjured this story wanted his audience to know that the Leung family was central to the self-defense system known as Wing Chun. Unfortunately, other than their names and order of succession, Yip Man gives us very few details concerning these men, so we'll have to extrapolate our own. If we can accept a purposeful placement of these characters in history, this timeline might give us some insight into what was really going on during the period in question. Let's look at each of these patriarchs, starting with Wing Chun's fictional husband Lombok Cho, whose name means wealthy companion. Other than his marriage to Yim Wing Chun, the only details Yip Man gives us about Lombok Cho are that he was a salt merchant and that he was from Fujian. Perhaps the Fujianese connection is homage to the Wing Chun village from which the White Crane system derived, or perhaps it's simply meant to connect other fighting systems of southern China. The detail that he is a salt merchant is intriguing. Salt is an inelastic commodity, meaning that it resists market forces and remains in demand regardless of price fluctuations. During the Leung period, the Chinese government placed heavy taxes on salt. This resulted in the formation of criminal networks for the purpose of smuggling untaxed salt, not unlike the networks that smuggled tea in the new American colonies at about the same time. As you might expect, this work often involved violence, whether or not your salt was government sanctioned, and a salt merchant was expected to travel and know how to defend himself. It may also be no coincidence that Chung Lai-chun, founder of the Bok Mei system, began his career in the salt industry. Thus, Lombok Cho possibly connects the Wing Chun myth to that of White Crane and White Eyebrow. If Yip Man gave us few details about Lombok Cho, he gives us next to nothing about Leung other than his name, which means blue orchid, like a character in Heroes of the Water Margin. In some of the embellished versions of the creation myth, Leung character ranges between a wealthy scholar, an osteopath, a monk, a recluse, and a patron of the arts or an actor in the opera. In other versions, he's altogether absent. In any case, Yip Man says he passed the art to 2 people. In the Leung succession, Wang Wabo is the exception. However, his surname is the same as that of Wang Fei-hung, a famous martial artist from Foshan and practitioner of Hung Gar. Wabo means precious flower. He is purportedly an actor on the Red Boat Opera Company, which was not actually founded until several decades later. Yip Man says that he was Leung Kuai's student, and then Leung Yitai joined them. Yitai, which means younger brother's second wife, is supposedly another member of the opera, and as his name might suggest, many versions have him playing female roles, as women were not allowed to act in those days, so effeminate men took those roles. In fact, all of the patriarchs associated with the opera have somewhat effeminate names. Perhaps the author meant to carry on the motif that Wing Chun was designed to equalize a fight on the side of the weak. Furthermore, it was not uncommon for a Chinese man to earn a new name, making these names meaningless as far as historical research is concerned. However, the Wing Chun Cantonese opera connection is tenuous at best. In the 20th century and in Wing Chun circles, it became popular to tell stories of how the crafty opera rebels would use their acting techniques and access to waterway escapes to harass the Qing government in Mission Impossible fashion. However, the Qing were meticulous record keepers, and no record that could tie the opera to such activity exists. Like the rest of this myth, the opera connection is most likely a composite of different stories. In 1854, the Qing, who had been fighting the Taiping Civil War for about 3 years, decided to raise taxes on Guangdong, a province that had not been involved in the dispute. Li Wenmao, the leader of the Opera Guild, got involved in a tax dispute and, for reasons still unclear, organized and led several opera companies into open rebellion that lasted from 1854 to 1856 and became known as the Red Turban Rebellion. For a bunch of actors, they were initially surprisingly successful. Using their acting skills, they convinced the populace that they represented order and justice, thereby gaining popular support. But they lost that support when they, in turn, tried to raise taxes and burned a village which refused to pay. At that point, it was basically over for them. In 1856, just 2 short years after it had begun, the Red Turban Rebellion, or Opera Rebellion, was completely quashed. Not only did the Qing quash the rebellion, they executed every surviving member of the opera and everyone they could find who was associated with it. Then they banned the Cantonese opera for the next 10 years. This cleansing, known as the White Terror, killed nearly 1 million people. Before the rebellion, the opera performers were known for their realism in stage battles, but not on the battlefield. In fact, they hired bodyguards and mercenaries to protect them when they traveled. After the rebellion, their reputation was stained by their defeat. However, during the time of the 1911 revolution, their story was revitalized as another piece of propaganda against the Qing. The final element in this part of the story is that the abbot, Jixin, was on the boat disguised as a cook and taught Wang Wabo and Leung Yitai how to fight with a pole. First, we've already shown that for Jixin's lifetime to span anyone's who could have taught Leung Jan would be impossible even if he weren't fictional. So we must explore his anachronistic inclusion in this story. As I said, the opera rebellion became popular in the early part of the 20th century when anti-Qing sentiment was high. It was at this time that people who had not lived through those events began to tell stories of the glorious opera rebellion. In these stories, Jixin, the erstwhile abbot of Shaolin, came to help the rebels. This was after the second publication of Everlasting, and it is the first mention of Jixin in the opera that we can find. The detail of his disguising himself as a cook also conjures Shaolin folklore. In his book, The Shaolin Temple, Mir Shahar relates how the monks of Shaolin achieved a theological justification for their decision to fight and defend themselves from roving bandit armies in the 7th century. They reasoned that since the transformed Buddha needed the converted demon Vajrapani to defend him in the spiritual realm, they would be the physical defenders of Buddhism in the physical realm. There is a later story of how, when the temple was attacked and the monks at the brink of defeat, the cook came out from behind the oven, wiped out the bandits, and as he walked away, grew into a giant who turned out to be the demon god Vajrapani. This story has been repeated many times in many forms. In fact, Jackie Chan played a version of this character in his 2011 movie, Shaolin. So now we see how this composite fairy tale trend continues with historical fiction from the opera rebellion and Shaolin mythology. For a much more detailed account of these stories and more, check out my book, The Creation of Wing Chun, and check out my co-author Ben Judkin's blog. Also stay tuned on this channel for more about how Wing Chun is your best self-defense option.